Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Um, I guess I'll just start with a little bit of an introduction on how I decided to choose this topic. I This was actually done the spring break of my sophomore year, but since I was in Rome last year, I didn't really have a chance to present it. Um, I sort of always had a fascination with Gothic architecture, and it only grew with Professor Stamper's class. But I felt like I never really got a chance to fully understand it, and I also felt a bit oppressed by the rigid classicism imposed by this program. Um, but so I talked to Professor Stamper a little bit. I talked to Professor Anthony Monto, the former associate director of the Nanovic Institute, and he directed me to a book called The Stones of Venice by John Ruskin, in which there's a chapter called On the Nature of Gothic. And some of the concepts found there really piqued my interest. Um, and so to quote John Ruskin here, he says, Imperfection is in some sort essential to all that we know of life. It is the sign of life in a mortal body, that is to say, a state of progress and change. Nothing that lives or can be rigidly perfect. Um, I am intrigued by that, and wanted to apply it to an example of Gothic architecture, and sort of was interested by Lincoln Cathedral in particular, thanks to, again, Professor Stamper's brief mention of it, with its very distinctive crazy vaults, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I also found on the website of the cathedral, which I know not very academic, but a quote attributed to John Ruskin saying that I've always held and proposed against all comers to maintain that the Cathedral of Lincoln is out and out the most precious piece of architecture in the British Isles. So that's sort of tied together with what I'd read in the Stones of Venice, and really led me to try to validate his claims, using Lincoln Cathedral as an archetype of Gothic architecture, and looking at the relationship between imperfection and beauty, and how they apply in a real world example. So I'll do a quick history of the city of Lincoln. Was originally a Roman colony, and in William the Conqueror's Norman invasion of the English island in 1066, the Normans arrived in Lincoln. Since it was a Roman colony, it was a walled city. It's up on a hill, so it was a very strategic location. It's sort of geographically centric. And so in 1068, William the Conqueror appointed one of his generals named Remigius, who's this guy in the rose window. He was appointed the bishop of the diocese. Essentially, Lincoln was to be the center of the diocese in one of the main dioceses in England. And the original construction of the cathedral began in 1072 and lasted for about 20 years after that. And was after Remigius's death, there was a couple of earthquakes and a large fire, and so went through various changes throughout the 11th and 12th century. And then in 1190-ish, Bishop Hugh from Avalon in France became the Bishop of Lincoln and built most of what we know the cathedral to be today. Hugh is a little bit of a folk hero in the area, and he's recognized as a saint in both the Anglican and the Catholic churches. So what we're seeing here is some of the remnants of the Norman construction with this Romanesque arch, one of the pier bases left over that they sort of keep beneath the floor. And this baptismal font was brought in by the Normans, but is actually older than the cathedral itself, and it's still in use. So it's was pointed out to me as sort of the oldest part of the church. This model is of the church sort of at its peak. This tall central spire is no longer in existence. It was completed in 1311, but was collapsed in a storm in 1548, but during that time of its existence, the peak of the spire made Lincoln Cathedral the tallest building in the world for that time. And so also to sort of point out the urban context of the cathedral, it's up on a hill. As you can see here, this is about a mile down the road, but it's still visible all the way at the top. And obviously quite large, quite imposing. And right across the way, this is taken from the roof of the cathedral, but this is Lincoln Castle, which was around before the cathedral was built as sort of the main civic center of the town. And so, again, here's some just other views. This is taken from inside the cloister, showing the chapter house here, again, which I'll get to in a little bit. And then this is sort of the main facade. As you can see, some of the Norman construction is also still visible from the outside in these Romanesque arches, and also this central arch here, which is tried to be covered over by the pointed Gothic arch, but it's still very present. And this general shape is actually, again, covered over, but was the facade of the original church from the 11th century. So again, here's just showing a little bit more of the church from the inside. These are two rose windows on opposite ends of the transept. This to the north is the dean's eye, and this to the south is the bishop's eye. And those were named after the two sort of religious authority figures that were in residence at the cathedral. The dean being somewhat of the pastor overseeing the facility, or the facilities and day-to-day life of the cathedral itself, and the bishop being the leader of the diocese. And since the cathedral was the center of the diocese for a couple of centuries, he was also in residence at the cathedral. And this also sort of brings me to one of the first major imperfections that I studied at the cathedral. The bishop's eye was undergoing a lot of weather damage, and so was taken out and intended to be restored. The tracery was restored sometime in the 14th century, but there was no good documentation of the window before the glass was taken out. So the craftsmen had to sort of just put it in where they could, and it results in sort of a nondescript kaleidoscope. You can't really see closely from this picture, but if I was actually handed binoculars by one of the tour guides so I could get a better look, and there's angels' heads and saints and different iconography going every which way. And it's quite fascinating, but also has no real rhyme or reason to the glass itself. And this is the chapter house, which would have been the meeting place for the authorities of the diocese. And also, as sort of a fun fact, it was used as used as the film site for the climax of the Da Vinci Code. Even though the movie, they say it was Canterbury Cathedral, but they couldn't get inside, so they went to Lincoln. Anyway, so these are the crazy vaults that I mentioned. As you can see, they don't align in the center. The ribs sort of crisscross. And this also sort of marks the starting point of St. Hugh's construction of the cathedral. There's not really any good explanation as to why this was done. It's really the only example of it, as far as anyone knows. There's sort of a legend that when the Pope found out that this is how this was being built, he ordered a cease and desist, and that the Hugh was told to build it with ribs that aligned in the center, like all the other churches that were being built at the time. And that's also sort of an explanation for why it's only over the choir, the central choir in the church. As you can see here, actually, this is looking east, so this is a later edition, but it would have started and gone this way, but then all the other vaults further down the nave align in the center, like most other Gothic churches. So then this is going back into the cloister. So the cloister's existence is really sort of an anomaly itself, because there was never any monastery attached to Lincoln, and the cloister was typically used as a vehicle for monastic prayer. So again, nobody really knows why there was a cloister built, but there's one there. And also another anomaly of the cloister is this wood vaulting here, just sort of atypical. Ordinarily probably would have been built with quarried limestone like the rest of the church, but for whatever reason it was built with wood. And on the north side of the cloister is a neoclassical arcade. The sort of Gothic tracery cuts out on just one face and is replaced with these, Tuscan-esque arches. But this was actually a library designed by Christopher Wren in 1674. It sort of just to show off the personal wealth of the dean at the time, and very out of place. Can't really critique Christopher Wren, I guess, but it's just completely out of context here. And so now these are just sort of some of the details that don't quite add up, getting into some of the more particular imperfections of the church. As I mentioned, Hugh started building over the choir and went east to west. And as I mentioned before, the Norman west facade is still there. Allegedly, Hugh had intended to knock that over, but ran out of money and sort of had to connect the nave that he was building with the pre-existing facade. And that resulted in an off-center shift, visible here. That's where it's going on if you're looking toward the west entrance. And it's about 18 inches to 2 feet. So really you wouldn't think that much, but it appears in these lancets flanking the entryway, whereas you can see this is almost double the width of this one here. And again, these are also just some sort of misaligned elements. Obviously this little colonnette is off center from this arch. Running down this vault, this painted ribs and the bosses are all slightly wiggly. And this little lancet is very clearly misproportioned here. Again, just more off-center vaults. This arch is a little bit bigger than this one. The windows don't align with the arches around them. And again here, another offset boss, misproportioned window under the bishop's eye. This is actually the front door from the inside facing out, where the tracery above the doorway is quite off there as well. And again, more of the same here in the nave. Some of the columns, or the piers rather, are not built using the same material on opposing sides. And here, these are sort of the outside walls of the aisles. This being the north side, this being the south side. The south side would have been the side the bishop would have entered the cathedral from. So there's a little bit more ornamentation with the dogtooth molding going around the arches. And also these colonnettes are set a little higher off the ground on the south side so that people could sit on them, but they didn't really want people sitting where the bishop was going to be walking by. So that's why this is a little bit close to the ground, which maybe hard to tell, but I tried to line them up there. But this was just sort of a temporary installation from a local artist's interpretation of the signs of the cross, or the is that right? The Passion, Stations of the Cross. Sorry. And there's also a number of instances where it's visible that restorations and additions don't quite add up with what had been there before. Here is showing during the Reformation, Oliver Cromwell's men sort of stormed the cathedral because it was Catholic at the time, and knocked all the heads off the saint statues. And later it was added the heads of bishops, because bishops didn't necessarily have to be associated with Catholics. But in several instances, there was a female saint who was given a male bishop's head, which this is one of those examples. This is the tomb of St. Hugh. Contemporary local artists won a competition to sort of add something to it. And it's this a little bit unfortunate iron sweep, which is supposed to represent the St. Hugh had a pet swan. And these stained glass windows are don't quite match up with hues and colors because they were sort of replaced and restored at various times throughout the centuries. This was a side chapel that was painted in 1956 by a post-impressionist painter named Duncan Grant. It's obviously not with the style of the rest of the church. It was actually so controversial at the time that the chapel was closed for several years. But anyway, these are some of the sketches I made, and I'd like to just leave you with some final thoughts. So the goal of my research was not to criticize the past or claim that what was done could have been done better. Rather, I wanted to acknowledge the mastery and the wisdom of the predominantly nameless creators of Lincoln Cathedral for their ability to put aside concern for perfection in pursuit of a timeless and undeniably beautiful whole. And also to leave you with John Ruskin. One of the things that he said that I sort of hope to prove with this project was, accept this then for universal law, that neither architecture nor any other noble work of man can be good unless it is imperfect. So, thank you.
Sorry. Was there any bit of knowledge that you gained from locals while you were there that you didn't expect to learn or prove especially fruitful?
I'm sorry, did I learn from what?
Like a piece of knowledge that you learned from the locals there?
Oh, the locals. Yeah, the locals didn't really care that I was there. I tried to talk to a few people, but none of them were really friendly. I was sort of there in the off season, so most people that were there were sort of elderly people from the surrounding areas. I learned a lot from the tour guides and the staff of the cathedral, but not necessarily any locals.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.